If you look at America today, the average household, adjusted for inflation, is making twice as much money than they were in the 1950s. Adjusted for inflation, the average household double the income that they were back then. And we're less happy. The statistics that try to measure happiness over time, it's not an easy thing to do, but we're less happy today than we were back then. And this is why, look, can money buy happiness? Yes. And to some extent, does it? Yes. Like people who are in abject poverty are not as happy as people who are covering the basics and they have food and shelter, et cetera, et cetera. But over time, when the society is getting richer and you're comparing yourself to other people, and maybe the average American's income doubled, but so did their neighbors, so did their coworkers, so did their siblings. So you just automatically adjust to that. I talked about Rockefeller before, John D. Rockefeller, who died in, I think, the 1930s. He was worth, adjusted for inflation, almost $500 billion during his day, adjusted for inflation. But he never had, during his life, penicillin, Advil, sunscreen, polio vaccine. Virtually everyone can take advantage of today that he never had. But you can't say that the average American is living better than Rockefeller today because we have all of these technologies that he never did. Because we just look at what other people have and assume that that is the baseline. So you can imagine a world in which my kids, my grandkids are earning twice as much as me, adjusted for inflation, and they're no happier for it. Because the new technologies, whatever it will be, that would seem like magic to you and I, will just become their baseline. If Thomas Jefferson or somebody came to the year 2023, he would faint at the new technologies and the medical discoveries that we have. And these are technologies that you and I don't spend 1 second being grateful for because we've just accepted them as a new baseline. If you want to be happier, you need to be ambitious. You need more. You need to make more money, work harder, have a more successful startup, whatever it would be. And that's true, but that's half the equation. The other half of the equation is keep your expectations low, so the gap between those two. It's the gap between those two that actually accrues to happiness over time.
How did you learn that?
I think there have been a couple little stories that really stuck out to me. One that I love, Stephen Hawking, the late physicist, who was, without exaggeration, one of the smartest people to ever walk this planet. He was just an absolute genius. And a quirk, of course, is that he had a motor neuron disease and he was paralyzed from head to toe. He had no control over his body. He spoke through a computer. Not a single muscle in his body could he actually control by himself. So he was, physiologically, it's one of the worst lives that you can imagine. And he did an interview with the New York Times a couple years before he died. And during the interview, he's talking about how happy he was and how amazing his life was. And the New York Times they asked him, what is your secret to happiness? Like, if there's anyone who has the right to complain about life, it's that guy. And he's talking about how happy he was. And he said, my expectations were reduced to 0 when I was 21, which is when he got his disease. And he said, everything else since then has been a bonus. So this is like the guy whose life is has ended up in a way that most people watching that would say, that's among the worst scenarios you can imagine. And he's probably happier than you and I because his expectations were so low that just waking up in the morning and seeing the sunrise and getting to go to work and talk to people was this magical gift. I mean, you can imagine, not to get too morbid about this, but imagine you're on your deathbed and the doctor is very confident that you're going to die tomorrow. And then let's say that you make it more day. What is that sunrise going to feel like? What's that, holding your wife's hand for one more day going to feel like? It'd be amazing just because your expectations were on the floor. And so it's always like that. And you go through life seeing so many people who have everything, all the money, the great family, all the health, the beauty, everything you can imagine, and they're not happy for it. And it's because with everything that they have, their expectations rise not only to that level, they might rise above it. So if your expectations rise faster than your income, you're never going to be happy with your money, no matter how much money you make. You can make $1 billion a year, but if you needed and wanted 1.1 billion, you're broke. You feel broke. And the reverse of that is true too. There are people who make $50,000 a year, but if they only need 40 to be happy, they're stoked. They feel great. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's so important, is because managing your own expectations is more in your control. I'm going to try to want less. That's just a mental exercise. That's not to say it's easy. It's not easy at all, but you have total control over doing it.